everyone. Welcome to a new episode of Carolyn Talks. I'm your host, Carolyn Hines, film critic and journalist, and this is the podcast YouTube channel where I speak to creatives about their work, the industry, and what inspires them. And today, I am joined by novelist, writer, Sara Collins, to talk about her book, The Confessions of Frannie Langton, which has been adapted into a miniseries starring Kara-Simone, Spence, and Sophie Cookson. And in a previous interview, I spoke to Sara and to Kara-Simone about the film, I keep saying film, but it's just a show, about the show and Simone's perspective on playing Frannie. But this time we're going to go a bit more in depth into the story. And I have so many things to ask Sara about her inspiration for this story. But before we begin that, as usual, I like to have my guests say a bit about themselves and what inspired them in their work as creatives. So for you, Sara, I know you did not start out as a writer. You went to school to be a lawyer. You practiced for, I think it was about 16 years, if I remember, if I saw right, 17 years. And you had a career to decide, I'm going to go and follow my bliss and be a writer, which I actually have a similar story. Like, I did not start as a film critic. I got my diploma in paralegal studies. So we also have that in common.
We both ditched the law.
So tell me, what was it about you? Tell us a bit about your background, because you were born in Jamaica. So let's start from there.
I was born in Jamaica. My parents are Jamaican. My dad was a barrister, actually. We left Jamaica when I was 4 in the middle of the 1970s during the political upheaval at the time, the transition in government. And I grew up in the Cayman Islands, although I came to boarding school in the UK when I was really tiny. I was 11 going on 12, I think, when I started boarding school in the UK. I did qualify as a lawyer. I followed in my dad's footsteps, and I spent 17 years as a lawyer, but they were, spoiler alert, 17 really miserable years. I did not enjoy law. And I think I didn't enjoy it because I had always wanted to be a writer. It's one of my very first memories is an encounter with a book. Or a story, I guess, is The Little Match Girl, the story of the Little Match Girl. And I have just always been in love with books more than anything else. I was a voracious, obsessive reader as a child and as a young woman. And I think for a lot of people, that kind of obsessive reading flips a switch. And, if you do it long enough, you want to write yourself. And that's certainly what happened to me. So eventually, after I ditched the law and finished raising my kids, I enrolled on a creative writing master's degree at Cambridge. And the novel Frannie was born there, finished and published in 2019. And I guess the rest is history, because we're here talking about the TV series now.
I guess you can say it's also the present, because what's interesting about the story of Frannie Langton is, though it's set in early 18th century England and also in scenes in Jamaica, it's always kind of fascinating to me, and also kind of troubling how society, we say the more things change, the more they stay the same. Like we're still talking about patriarchy. Women were functioning in a patriarchal society. We're still talking about racism. We're still talking about colorism. We're still talking about the effects and the trauma of the enslavement of Black people, of our ancestors, and how that still affects us today, and the show touches on these kind of things. Though it's set back then, we can still relate so much to Frannie and the things she says and the things she experiences, because so much of our society, so much of how it functions and sees Black people and sees Black women has not changed. Right? Which is
sad, tragic, infuriating.
It is.
Yes.
It is. Because people will be like, why do Black people so focus on these things? I'm like, well, I still get racially profiled, when I had hair on my head, I still have people trying to put their hands in my hair. I still have people questioning, like, what are cornrows? What are braids? All of these things. People still don't understand that Barbados is not in Jamaica. But you know what I mean? Like, people, like, the knowledge of the Caribbean and the knowledge of Black history and the knowledge of slavery also doesn't really, I think the interesting thing for your show is, it, again, and I know some people might take umbrage with this, but like it reminds people that slavery didn't only happen in North America. Slavery didn't only happen in America. It happened in the Caribbean. Like before they got taken to the Carolinas and to the South in America, they landed in the Caribbean first. They landed in Barbados. Then they got sent to Jamaica and Martinique and all these other countries. So your show like addresses that because it centers how like the history of slavery does still impact the Caribbean,
Mm-hmm.
And so for you, like now we're talking about Frannie and everything. I have to ask first, where did the idea for this particular story, for the story of Frannie Langton, come from?
It came from all of that obsessive reading I just talked about. There was a period of time during my teenage years when I was really obsessed with Gothic romances for some reason. I mean, I absolutely gobbled up all of the Brontes, loved Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights in particular. That reading was formative. The stuff you love as a teenager, I think, kind of enters your DNA in some way. The other stuff that entered my DNA was Toni Morrison, thank goodness. And I think probably this is, now that I think about it, a fusion of those two influences. But the thing that had troubled me about my reading of those Gothic novels was that this is a whole long tradition in English literature that had overlooked the existence of people like you and me, I guess, people with women of a Caribbean background. And the Caribbean, as you say, was such an essential component in the development of British history, which coincided with the development of the novel in the early 19th century. And there are oblique references to the Caribbean in Jane Eyre. Bertha Mason's roots are Creole, and in Wuthering Heights, there's an implication that Heathcliff is a mixed race character. But very oblique. There was never anything centering a character with a background like mine. And so I realized early on, and it kind of stayed with me, that I'd spent a lot of time in love with this material that hadn't really put someone like me front and center. That's quite an alienating, disorienting thing to realize. So when I came to write a novel, I think it was probably only natural that I would use the power, and I do think it's a power. I think it's an incredible power of storytelling. I would use the power that gave me to right that wrong. The motivation for it was, as I've said elsewhere, and probably said the last time you interviewed me as well, but it bears repeating. It was very much to put a Jamaican woman in this territory, in Jane Austen territory. And, that feels refreshing. It feels revolutionary. It's something I didn't see growing up and that I would have loved to see. And I'm really proud to have been a part of doing that with a novel and now with a TV series.
No, I'm so glad because I, like you, grew up reading Charlotte Bronte, Jane Eyre, Jane Austen, all of these classical female writers of that era. And I think a lot of it also comes to me because I grew up in the Caribbean. Like I tell people in the Caribbean, our reading, like what we are sent to read in primary school and secondary school is not what North American students get to read. We had to read like Eden Blyton, and these kind of stories in primary school. And then like you just like kind of like transition to reading more, I guess you could say more British literature. And like Jane Austen is one of my favorite writers, but like you, like people talk about representation, but when I'm reading these books, like we know that these characters are not Black. We know like the world that of these characters is very white. But then, especially coming, like I just said, like the Caribbean is so instrumental in how Britain came to be Britain. Like Barbados used to be called Little Britain. Like that was historically what we were called because our economy contributed so much to the British economy. Jamaica contributed so much to the British economy. Same thing with Scotland and Ireland. My last name is Hines, which is Irish, and my dad's last name is Cummins, which is Scottish. Or do we have that? It's one of the two. But we have all of these connections to Britain and to like that part of Europe. But in literature, we don't get acknowledged. Though the wealth of the characters come from slavery, the wealth of the characters come from the sugar and cotton and tobacco and the molasses trade and all of these things. This is how this is how Britain got built up. This is how these manor houses, these palaces, their industry got built up off of the Caribbean, off of this backs of the enslaved Black people, but we don't get acknowledged in the history, in the literature, particularly on screen. You know, one of the first films, and I think it was probably the very first film that I have a very clear distinction of, where a Black woman is centered in the story, is the story of Dido Bell. You know, like, and even then the film act doesn't ignore the history of Black people, because one of the things that I love about that film, because it talks about the painting where Dido, she's the first Black woman to be centered in a painting from that era. And that's why when I saw that painting that is placed on that Frannie looks at, where she sees Laddie, that's where I remember I told you in the interview, I'm like, that's where I remembered your reference, because there's so many paintings like that where you have the Black children, the Black footmen, the Black maids. They're adding on just as like, they're not people, they're just objects to prop up the white people in these paintings. So I love that your story and the inspiration for Frannie comes from that. And I can relate so much to that, because as I told you, like, I love that we're both from the Caribbean and that we can relate to these stories, and I can see that connection. So now, in talking also about the inspiration for Frannie and the history that you wanted to bring up and to center a Black character, now I have to ask you about making her queer, about making her lesbian, and having her a same-sex relationship, because I think that's honestly truly groundbreaking in a way, not only because you're centering a Black woman having a love story, but also having a queer love story. And for the Caribbean, that's still something that isn't really spoken about in the Caribbean. You know, like, it's there. We know, like, there are gay people and everywhere, queer people everywhere, but to have a black woman who was a slave, who is in the position that she's in, and she's been given to this white family, she's having a love affair with with Marguerite, played by Sophie Cookson. Tell me about doing that, about instead of making her having the typical love story with like the man.
I used to do a lot of human rights advocacy in my former job as a lawyer. And one of the areas that I did quite a bit of work in was in the Caribbean, was to do with gay rights. And you're entirely correct to identify that we still have a long way to go in the region. You know, there is this kind of entrenched homophobia. And one of the reasons I think for Frannie being a queer Black character is that I was very determined that if my beloved island people were going to support this project, that they would also have to engage with that aspect of her identity. I think stories, even more than legislation and soapboxing, can kind of nudge people's opinions along. You know, I've been really gratified by the number of people from Grand Cayman, where I grew up, who have read the novel, you know, people who are very conservative and often quite elderly, who've read the novel and perhaps had their eyes opened, you know, seeing the story of someone like Frannie from the inside. The power of that's not to be underestimated. But also, it just was natural. I've answered this question before, and I have said, and it's true, that it wasn't a conscious decision in the sense that, you know, although I wanted people to, in the Caribbean, to come to terms with this aspect of her identity, it also was an incredibly natural aspect of the character. And that's because it was who she was. It was how she came. She came with this identity, and it made sense in the context of her experience, in particular what had happened to her in Jamaica, in the context of this house. As I've said before, the fact that almost all of the men in this story are completely despicable characters, and that Madame is a woman very much like her, with the same sensibility, with the same passions, with the same desires. It made sense that the love story would be a love story between the two of them. Also, this, for me anyway, is very much a meditation on women's anger. It's a very feminist story. It's supposed to center women, and you're not really going to do that if you're distracted by a kind of heterosexual love affair, you know, men getting in the way. So that's where the power, that's where the electricity in the story came from for me. It was just really important to follow the character where she wanted to go in this respect.
Great. Sorry, excuse me. My dog is here licking me. Charlene!
Well, your dog should then make a cameo, I think.
Sorry.
Are you keeping this bit in?
I might. Like, normally I'll cut it out, but it's so funny. Shut the door. Oh my gosh, she's something else. She always does this. She'll leave me alone completely, but as soon as I start interview, she'll
because she hears you talking, she wants to get in on whatever you're doing.
She just wants attention. She don't care about me. Sorry about that. But in going from that, the other thing, I think I just said Frannie being queer, being lesbian felt natural. Like when I first watched the first episodes, I had the same thought. I'm like, this feels natural. This feels like not only who she is with regards to gender, sexual identity, but considering her past. You know, as you said, all of the men except for Laddie are extremely despicable human beings. And with the past that she has, coming from this ironically named plantation home called Paradise in Jamaica, she either saw men as victims, being the other Black men who are enslaved, and she can't be around them because she's been barred from being around them. I noticed that she gets separated from the other Black people. You know, once she's taken from her mother, she doesn't have any other Black people around her, including men. And then the only male that she's around constantly is this white man who is experimenting and torturing and mutilating Black people. So she doesn't have any positive references for Black men or for men, period, any positive references for them. You know, she doesn't have any positive relationships. And then the next man that we're introduced to as the audience is another man who is also an extremely despicable man, who then turns out to be Madame's husband, and he's a despicable human being as well. So in all of this, when I saw the first episode, and then as the story went on, like I can see why this is a natural for her, and you know, this is who this character is. And then it also, as you were saying, like it's a feminist story. And I think with regards to me, when you're talking about feminism, you have to talk about the good and the bad. And to me, Madame is like a amalgamation of both. You know, where you can show there's white women or women of other races who can befriend Black women. They can be friends with Black women. We have similarities. Like they both get each other's attention because they're in love with literature. You know, they're both avid readers. They both love poetry. They love the classics and all of that. And they also have a natural chemistry, you know, a natural pull to each other. But then in that pull comes the power imbalances. This is still a white woman. You know, this is still a wealthy white woman. This is still a wealthy white woman who is married to the man that Frannie has been given away to. So, and then in the interactions they have, you can see that Madame Marguerite doesn't have a full understanding of Frannie's situation, you know, and that's how you can say you can have feminism. You can have a woman who's feminist, but is not actually truly embracing the word of feminist, you know, because she's still self-centered. She's still extremely selfish. She still has a very myopic way of seeing the world because she sees things from her perspective. So talk about that aspect of feminism in the story and in the relationship between Frannie and Marguerite.
I mean, isn't that a challenge? You know, it's a kind of eternal challenge for feminism, isn't it? It's a challenge for humanity, in fact, trying to see the world from someone else's perspective. Another thing to mention about Madame is she's an addict. You know, she's addicted to laudanum, which breeds its own particular kind of selfishness. She's a very vulnerable, damaged woman. Internally, I think she believes she's doing the right thing, but often she hurts people through sheer inadvertence or selfishness. There's something, I think, to be said there about intersectionality in feminism. About the possibility or impossibility of making room for other people's experiences. And I know, I mean, I've experienced it myself. I experience it to this day, that the most well-meaning of people, of women, white women, may not necessarily be able to grasp the complexities of the challenges that Black women have to face. You know, we're women, but our experience of womanhood is separated by that one random defining characteristic, and out of that springs a number of complications. You know, I think about the Well, I was going to say the Sojourner Truth speech, but apparently that was translated by someone who may have butchered her language. But, you know, this idea that she asked the question, which I like to think she asked in her own way, am I not a woman? Because where our experiences of womanhood intersect, I think it's up to Black women to take the lead in ensuring that our stories are told properly and respected. That's one of the challenges for Frannie and Madame. I don't want to spoil anything, but, you know, obviously we know the story ends tragically. So we know there are some challenges they haven't been able to surmount. It is one of the complications of their love affair. But I also like to think that they were trying to love each other. You know, this is just my take on it as the sort of person who created them, that they were trying to love each other in a world that had inflicted different kinds of damage on each of them that just might at times have made that really difficult or impossible.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think not only the world inflicted damage on them, I think one of the things that really interests me about them is that they both see each other as being oppressed, you know, but they also, I think they skirt around the issue of what their differences in oppression is. You know, like they're both oppressed, but the oppression is like completely different. You know, like Madame still is able to walk out through that door when she's ready. You know, she still has a pathway to claiming a life that she wants, whereas Frannie is still bound by the fact that she's a Black woman, you know, like that's still
interesting you say that, because the one who actually does end up walking out through the door is Frannie, not Madame. You know, she's the one who has a kind of opportunity to make a way for herself, and she I'm not going to spoil it, but she, you know, she does see there are avenues that are open to women like her. Maybe avenues that Madame thinks are not open to women like her. So I just thought these two characters gave me so much room to think about how even within the experience of womanhood, there are all of these degrees of difficulty, you know, degrees of hardship and oppression. I hate that word oppression, but I mean, I suppose it's a reality. I also hate the word marginalization, but, you know, Madame's a person who, compared to Frannie, is at the center and doesn't see herself that way. And I was really interested in that as a writer. I think when you are creating characters, you cannot judge the characters from your own point of view. You have to inhabit them from the inside. And so when I think about Madame, I understand how she feels trapped. But then I also understand how, from the perspective of Frannie and other people around her, she's simply spoiled. But isn't that the reality of many women like her? You know, it was really interesting to grapple with that.
Yeah, I do see Madame as being trapped. Like the term I use for her is like a bird in a gilded cage, you know?
Yeah, very gilded.
And she is a very sympathetic character, but like in seeing her in being able to see her as a sympathetic character, I can also see how she is in a sense spoiled and isn't good for Frannie. She's the one who gets Frannie addicted to laudanum too. And I saw that as a way for her, maybe unconsciously trying to get Frannie to see the world from she does, because laudanum is kind of like from what I've read, is something that alters people's perception of reality, you know. And so like if Frannie is addicted to her the same as she does, she'll see the world the way that Madame does. And it also gives them another connection that Madame doesn't have with anyone else, because even in the house, like, she's not seen as being a legitimate wife, you know, like she's still looked down upon by the maids and all of that. And I think a lot of that has to do with her being French, but that's going into a whole different discussion between the politics of the French and the Brits at that point in time.
Yeah, but it's important to I think to kind of make reference to that, because she was an outsider. I mean, one of the themes of this is immigration. Talk about contemporary problems. You know, immigration is an eternal thorn in our side. And back then in Britain, the French were, you know, really looked down upon. That, you know, there was this whole sort of influx of refugees, which is essentially what they were, from the French Revolution. And it's pretty interesting to point that out, because in a way they each have this experience of being an outsider in the society and of being looked down upon because they're immigrants. Right. Yet we come back to the fundamental difference between them, which was race, which just sort of annihilates all the differences and kind of superimposes itself on everything as this kind of overwhelming force.
Yeah, we're obvious. I want to obviously talk about Bridgerton because I have very particular thoughts about Bridgerton. But I want to go back a bit because you just said that you didn't like the words oppression and marginalization. May I ask why?
Well, my take on it, and it's only mine, is that I reject any word that suggests how someone else sees me. So I do not feel marginalized. And I think it was Toni Morrison who said something, I will paraphrase her badly, but she said something to the effect that she's the center of her own universe, which is how I feel. I am not a marginalized person from my own perspective. And so when I inhabit my own perspective, my own sense of self rejects that description. Obviously, in society, I am marginalized, but it's a very weakening word. You know, it's a word that takes away your power. And so there's something in me that recoils against it. If that makes sense. Perhaps the reality is that there are ways in which I am marginalized, but I am not a marginalized person. That's the only way I can put it.
No,
so
I understand.
Words, or when I have to use those words, there is this strange subconscious almost barrier to using them. You know, when they fit, I use them, but I never enjoy doing so. And I'm a writer. I have this relationship with words where, you know, they have to be deployed exactly how they're meant for me. And I think that's why I react to those in this way.
No, I relate to you completely. Like for me, like we're talking about immigration a bit. Like for me, I'm an immigrant. I'm from Barbados. I moved to Canada. And when I first moved here, I didn't see myself as an immigrant. I didn't really understand like the depth of that word, you know. But now that I'm older, I've been living here, this year will be 15 years. I embrace the word immigrant for me personally, because it reminds to me, it centers the fact that I'm Barbadian, you know, that Barbados is my homeland. That's where I'm from. That's where my people are from. That's where my family's from. Yes. My navel string is buried there, you know, as we say, like the ocean, like I have this picture of Browns Beach. This is my favorite place on earth. Like when I go home to Barbados, one of the first things I do is go straight to the beach, and I just chill out at the beach for hours.
So important. I couldn't agree with you more, because we come from such a diasporic region. You know, there is so much immigration that people can read into the immigration a sense that we devalue our homelands. And it's the opposite, you know, that it's really important that we love, that we take pride in where we come from, that we show that pride, you know, that we remember the places, that we honor them. I feel the same way about Jamaica, which, you know, I left when I was 4. So I'm even further away from it than you are from Barbados. But it's part of me. My parents really instilled this kind of sense of pride in the place. It's important that we demonstrate it. It's why I write about Jamaica as well.
Yeah, no, and that's it completely. And it's not only for me about being proud of Barbados and being proud of being from the Caribbean. For me, it's also because Canada is a settler colonial state, you know, like this is the home of the Native people. This is the home of the First Nations people. And I acknowledge that. And I always remind people, anyone who is not Native First Nations is an immigrant. I have to, whether you have been here for 4 or 5 generations, if you are white, this is not your land. So that's another way for me to, that's one of the reasons I claim the word. And also with regards to like oppression and marginalization, I also relate to that as well, because you know how they used to say like the Caribbean and South America, Latin America is like a third world country. I'm like, I don't use phrases like that. I don't say like I'm from a third world country. I don't believe in like leveling or like giving like countries say first or second world or third world. I'm like, no, I don't believe in like classist systems and like, you know, classifying places and people that way. So I completely relate to you and I understand what you're saying about using the words oppression and marginalization. And a perfect segue to my last and final question. Like I mentioned, Bridgerton. So one of the other things that drew me to the show, and one of the things I really love about it, is that it is still a Gothic romance. It is still an ill-fated tragic romance, because Gothic, you know, tragic ending, all of this. Yes. And it's a period drama, and it's talking about romances between Black and white, between the classes, and between discussing social status. And there's, of course, shows like Bridgerton. And one of the things I do, and I've written about this, so this is not a revelation for anyone who's watching this, I do have issues with Bridgerton in how it romanticizes how Black people would have been treated then, you know? And like, for me, the thing with the show is like slavery, because they reference slavery. They say, oh, you know, the slave trade and all this. I'm like, are we not going to discuss how these houses are built off of the backs of slaves? You know, are we not going to discuss how Black people would have been treated back then. Like, even if you want to say this is, you're idealizing relationships between Black and white people, you can't say that this is a fictional world when you're referencing slavery. You know, for me, it's like, it doesn't make sense, and that's something I can't brush across. And so your show, the show and the book, to me, is very important because it's telling it's educating a lot of people about what the world was then. Because before Bridgerton, we didn't have anything that put Black people in places in England. And yes, there were wealthy Black people then. You know, there were wealthy Black people that had like white as well as Black and Southeast Asian people working for them. And there were like people from Korea and China and Japan were living in England at that time. And media and English media, white male media, doesn't acknowledge that. So you have Bridgerton inserting people of color in a world that they did exist in, but not realistically. And that for me is like a contradiction, you know, because I'm like, if you're going to talk about slavery, you got to talk about the effects of slavery. You got to talk about how these people came to be, you know, like, and you got to talk about colonialism and the English monarchy and how they displaced so many people in these other countries. So for you, I wanted to ask you your opinion on a show about like Bridgerton, you know, because it has such a massive impact on media. And I think for me, it's just like, it's also to me a very negative impact because a lot of people aren't being genuine about the discussion. Like, they're talking about, you know, like a romance between Black and white. I'm like, even if you're going to say there's no racism, you still got to talk about the sexism. You know, you still got to talk about this is a patriarchal society. You know, you still got to talk about how there's separation of classes because you have these people doing arranged marriages and all of that. But I'm like, you can't have one without the other. It's just
Bridgerton. I mean, so Bridgerton, it's funny because that show actually came out long after I'd written the novel. In fact, it came out after I'd written all of these screenplays. So, you know, I was thinking, oh, shucks, you know, this has really changed the landscape. Actually, it has changed the landscape for the better. I mean, there is a place for shows like that. It's so significant, absolutely hugely significant, that someone with the power of Shonda Rhimes has managed to sell the world on the idea of colorblind casting in a period drama. I mean, you know, refreshing, revolutionary, all the rest of it. I read the novels long before writing my own and really enjoyed them, but they were novels that were written very much from a white point of view. There was no color blindness about the novels themselves. So this is an element that has crept into the adaptation. And the way I look at it is that I love the Bridgerton effect. I love it because it has opened doors, because it's given so many opportunities to creatives of color and actors of color. I mean, it's allowed us to indulge in a little bit of sort of wishful thinking about that period. But I bear in mind that Bridgerton is a fantasy, and I think it's important that people enjoy it, but don't believe it, if that makes sense, that it is wishful thinking and it's really lovely to see. I think it's, you know, just on the level of spectacle, it's beautifully produced. It's really lush. It's, you know, some great performances, very sort of addictive if you love Regency romance. But, and I've said this before, the but is that there are so many people that do not know the truth about the history of Britain that I worry a little bit that the Bridgerton effect means they'll be lulled into a kind of false belief about how easy it was, you know, but here are Black people in Regency England who are dukes and duchesses and who are with absolutely no trouble at all entering into interracial marriages and having interracial children. And it wasn't like that. And I think if you're aware of the history of enslavement and what that experience was like and how much the foundations of modern Britain are built on that experience, then it's a slight disservice not to bear witness to the truth of that. I do feel very conscious that my ancestors would have been part of that really crippling system, and that in a way it is honoring their memory by telling the truth when we have storytelling power, telling the truth about what they went through. And so the way I look at it is that there's room for both. There's a place for Bridgerton if we accept that Bridgerton is fantasy and beautifully produced and a wonderful show. And you can like it if you know what it is that you're liking. But there's also a desperate need for some truth telling in storytelling, for us to finally acknowledge and come to terms with and commemorate this really difficult history to which we all owe so much. And so the idea behind our show was to combine those two objectives, that there is such an appetite for period drama now. There's room for all kinds of shows doing all kinds of things. And our show is trying to take the best of Bridgerton, if you like, but also the best of our ability to tell truthful stories and kind of merge those two things together.
Hey, perfect. Thank you so much for talking with me, Sara. I wish we had more time, but you have to go and I can't.
I do. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for having me. I hope we get an opportunity to speak again someday. Maybe.
Yes, and say hi to your dog for me.
I will. She's outside with my sister now. She's been relegated to the living room, but I will.
Thank you, Caroline.
Thank you so much, Sara. Have a great day and much success.
Thank you.
So everyone, this was another episode of Carolyn Talks for Here's What Happened podcast. I'm your host, Carolyn Hines, and today I was joined by novelist and writer Sara Collins to discuss her book, The Confessions of Frannie Langton, which has been adapted for screen by BBC. You can find the episodes of this mini-series available on BritBox internationally. That includes Canada, the US, England, and in northern regions as well. Thank you so much to Sara for joining me to talk about her work and what inspired her to create this story. I find it fascinating to have a story about Frannie and one as a character who's as complex as she is. It was great to talk to Sara about being inspired by her Caribbean upbringing and the Caribbean heritage, and also the fact that sometimes we start out in life doing one thing and we end up doing something else completely different that brings us very unexpected results, which for Sara was beginning as a lawyer and now she's a novelist writing stories like this. And I encourage everyone to watch this show. I think it's great for bringing up discussions on patriarchy, the history of racism and slavery in the Caribbean, and as well as in England, intersectionality between women and men, as well as feminism and colorism and racism, as well as mental health. And there's so many things to talk about. I wish we had more time, but we didn't. But I appreciate the time that she gave to speak to me today. You can find the video version of this episode on my YouTube channel. That is youtube.com @Carolyn_Hines. We can find other interviews that I've done throughout the last couple of years, including one that I previously did with Sara and leading actress Kara-Simone Spence, who plays Frannie in the show. You can also go to my R3 page, that's authorry.com, Carolyn Hines, Hinds, and find links to all of my videos, my YouTube channels, as well as my published writing, that's reviews, film analysis, interviews, profiles, and the like. Follow me on social media at Carolyn. What am I saying? At CariCNH, that's CariECNH12. That's on Twitter, Instagram, and on TikTok. And until the next episode of Carolyn Talks, everyone, stay safe. Bye.